When the rope burns cut into Maggie O'Brien's wrists as the vengeful crowd dragged her through the dusty streets of Millbrook for the crime of carrying a child without a husband, she thought her life was over, until a mysterious widower on horseback stepped forward and claimed her as his bride before the entire town. But when her past comes riding back to reclaim what he abandoned, will her marriage of convenience become something worth fighting for? Maggie O'Brien's bare feet slapped against the cold wooden floor as she rushed to the window, her heart pounding like a hammer on an anvil. Outside, the morning fog rolled across the Kansas prairie like a gray blanket, but she could still see them coming. A line of dark shapes moving toward her little house like storm clouds gathering before a tornado. The year was 1867, and Millbrook had grown from a tiny railroad stop into a proper town with a church, a school, and enough people to have opinions about everyone else's business. Maggie pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching the group of women march down the dirt road that led to her front door. Their black dresses flapped in the wind like the wings of angry crows, and even from a distance, she could see the hard lines of their faces. She knew why they were coming. The secret she'd been hiding under loose dresses and thick shawls couldn't stay hidden much longer. Her belly had started to round like a melon, and in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, whispers traveled faster than wildfire in dry grass. "Please," she whispered to the empty room, though she wasn't sure who she was asking for help. Her parents had died of fever 2 winters ago, leaving her alone in the world with nothing but this small house and the job she'd lost last week when Mrs. Henderson noticed her condition and decided she was no longer suitable to work in the general store. The knock on her door came like thunder, loud, angry, and demanding. Maggie smoothed her brown hair back from her face and walked slowly toward the sound. Her legs felt shaky, like a newborn colt trying to stand for the first time. Maggie O'Brien. The voice belonged to Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife and the unofficial leader of every important decision in Millbrook. "Open this door right now." Maggie turned the metal handle and stepped back as 6 women pushed into her small front room. They filled the space like water flooding a cellar, their eyes sharp and cold as winter ice. Mrs. Caldwell stood in front, her gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. Behind her stood Mrs. Patterson from the post office, Mrs. Williams who ran the boarding house, and 3 other women whose faces Maggie recognized from church, but whose names she'd never learned. "Sit down," Mrs. Caldwell commanded, pointing to the wooden chair beside Maggie's small kitchen table. "We need to talk." Maggie remained standing. Something inside her chest felt hot and bright, like coals in a fire that refused to die. These women had come to her home uninvited, treating her like a child who needed scolding instead of a grown woman who deserved respect. "This is my house," Maggie said quietly. "I'll stand if I want to stand." Mrs. Patterson gasped like she'd been slapped. The nerve! After what she's done, she still acts high and mighty. "What exactly have I done?" Maggie asked, though she knew the answer. In Millbrook, being unmarried and pregnant was worse than stealing or lying or breaking any of the 10 commandments written in stone. Mrs. Caldwell's face turned red as a ripe tomato. "Don't play innocent with us, girl. The whole town can see your condition. Walking around bold as brass, showing off your shame for everyone to see." "I haven't been showing off anything," Maggie replied. "I've been trying to work and take care of myself, same as always." "Work?" Mrs. Williams laughed, but the sound held no joy. "Who's going to hire a woman in your state? You're a bad example to the young girls in this town. What if they think they can behave like you and face no consequences?" The words hit Maggie like stones thrown at her back. She'd heard whispers before, seen the way people looked at her in the street, but having these women say such things to her face made her feel smaller than a mouse in a field full of hawks. "I never asked for this," Maggie said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Didn't you?" Mrs. Caldwell stepped closer, close enough that Maggie could smell the soap and starch on her clothes. "Didn't you make choices that led to this situation? Didn't you forget every lesson your poor mother tried to teach you about proper behavior?" Mentioning her mother was like twisting a knife in an old wound. Maggie's eyes filled with hot tears, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't give these women the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "My mother taught me to be kind to people," Maggie said. She taught me not to judge others when I don't know their whole story. Kind. Mrs. Patterson's voice rose like a bird's screech. Was it kind to bring scandal to our town? Was it kind to make decent families worry about their own daughters following your example? The other women nodded and murmured agreement, their voices blending together like wasps buzzing around a disturbed nest. Maggie felt surrounded, trapped in her own home by people who had decided her fate without asking what she thought or felt or needed. I think it's time you left Millbrook, Mrs. Caldwell announced, her words falling like a judge's hammer. Pack your things and go somewhere else to handle your situation. Somewhere far away where nobody knows you. This is my home, Maggie said again, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. Not anymore, Mrs. Williams said with a cruel smile. Not for someone like you. They left as suddenly as they'd arrived, their dark dresses swishing as they filed out through Maggie's front door. But their words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, filling every corner of the small house with the smell of judgment and rejection. Maggie sank into the wooden chair she'd refused earlier, her hands trembling as she covered her face. Outside, she could hear their voices growing fainter as they walked back toward town, probably planning their next move in the campaign to drive her away from the only place she'd ever known as home. The baby moved inside her belly, a small flutter that reminded her she wasn't truly alone. But as she sat in the growing silence of her empty house, Maggie wondered if love could survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy anyone who didn't fit perfectly into its narrow ideas of right and wrong. What would happen to her and her unborn child if the whole town decided they had no place in Millbrook? The morning sun painted Millbrook's main street gold and orange as Maggie walked toward Henderson's general store, her empty basket swinging at her side and hope flickering in her chest like a candle in the wind. 3 days had passed since the women's visit, and she'd decided that hiding in her house would solve nothing. She needed food, she needed work, and most of all, she needed to prove to herself that she still had the right to exist in the place where she'd been born and raised. The town was waking up around her. Smoke rose from chimneys like gray ribbons against the bright sky. Dogs barked from behind wooden fences, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rhythmic pounding of the blacksmith's hammer on hot metal. These were the sounds of her childhood, as familiar as her own heartbeat, and she refused to believe they would be taken away from her. But as she walked, Maggie noticed things that made her stomach twist with worry. Mrs. Thompson, who used to wave and call out cheerful greetings, suddenly found something very interesting to stare at in her front yard. Mr. Davies, the postmaster, turned and walked in the opposite direction when he saw her coming. Even the children seemed to have been warned away. The street that was usually full of laughing, running youngsters was strangely empty. The bell above Henderson's door chimed as Maggie stepped inside, and the sound seemed louder than usual in the quiet store. Behind the counter, Mr. Henderson looked up from his ledger book, his face showing the kind of uncomfortable expression people wore when they had to deliver bad news. "Morning, Maggie," he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson." Maggie set her basket on the wooden counter and pulled out a small cloth bag that contained her last few coins. "I need some flour, sugar, and salt. Just small amounts." Mr. Henderson's hands stayed flat on his ledger book instead of moving to get her supplies. "Maggie, I'm sorry, but I can't sell you anything today." The words hit her like cold water thrown in her face. "What do you mean?" "My wife. She thinks it would be better if you shopped elsewhere. She's worried about what the other customers might think if they see you in here." "Mrs. Henderson has known me since I was 5 years old," Maggie said, her voice growing stronger with confusion and hurt. "She taught me how to count change when I worked here. Why would she suddenly care what people think about me buying flour?" Mr. Henderson couldn't meet her eyes. He stared down at his ledger book like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Things change, Maggie. You know how people talk in a small town." "Yes, I do know how people talk," Maggie replied. "But I didn't think you were the kind of man who let other people's talk determine how you treated your neighbors." The accusation hung between them like a wall neither could climb over. Mr. Henderson's face turned red, and Maggie could see that her words had found their mark. He was a good man at heart, but even good men sometimes chose the easy path over the right one. "I'm sorry," he said again, but the words sounded hollow. Maggie picked up her basket and walked toward the door, her head held high despite the burning shame in her chest. But as she reached for the handle, the door swung open so hard it banged against the wall. Deputy Marcus Reed filled the doorway like a thundercloud, his badge catching the morning light and his face set in hard lines that Maggie remembered from their childhood. Marcus had always been bigger than the other boys, always ready to use his size to get what he wanted. Now he wore that size like a weapon, along with the authority of his position. Well, Marcus said, his voice smooth as honey but with something poisonous underneath. "If it isn't our little problem child." "I'm not a child, Marcus," Maggie said, though standing next to him made her feel small and vulnerable. "And I'm not your problem. Aren't you, though?" Marcus stepped fully into the store, forcing Maggie to back up toward the counter. "See, the good people of this town have been coming to me with concerns. They're worried about the example you're setting for their daughters. They're worried about the kind of influence you might have on the younger women." Behind the counter, Mr. Henderson suddenly became very busy rearranging jars of candy, pretending he couldn't hear the conversation happening in his own store. "What kind of influence?" Maggie asked, though she was beginning to understand that this wasn't a conversation. It was a trap closing around her. Marcus smiled, but the expression was cold as winter ice. "The kind that makes girls think they can behave however they please without facing consequences. The kind that makes them forget their proper place in society." "I never told anyone to do anything," Maggie protested. "I've kept to myself, minded my own business, and tried to hurt no one." "Your very existence is telling them something," Marcus replied. "It's telling them that a woman can make shameful choices and still walk around town with her head held high. That's a dangerous message, Maggie." The unfairness of it made Maggie's hands clench into fists at her sides. She was being punished not for anything she'd said or done, but simply for refusing to disappear and hide her shame in some dark corner where polite society wouldn't have to look at it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Marcus's smile grew wider, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "I want you to leave, pack up your things and find somewhere else to live. Somewhere far away from Millbrook. This is my home." "Not anymore," Marcus said, echoing the words Mrs. Caldwell had used 3 days before. "The town council has been discussing your situation, and we've reached a decision. You're no longer welcome here." "The town council?" Maggie's voice rose with disbelief. "You mean a group of men got together and decided my fate without even talking to me?" "We don't need to talk to you," Marcus said, his voice growing harder. "Your actions speak loud enough. You made your choices, and now you need to live with the consequences." "And if I refuse to leave?" Marcus's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, not quite touching his weapon but making sure she noticed where his fingers were. "Then I'll be forced to take official action. For the good of the community, you understand." The threat was clear, even though Marcus had wrapped it in polite words. Maggie felt her knees start to shake, but she forced herself to stay upright. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. "You're all cowards," she said quietly. "Every single one of you. You'd rather destroy one person than admit that maybe your perfect little town isn't as pure as you pretend it is." Marcus's face darkened like a storm cloud, and Maggie knew she'd pushed too far. But the words had needed to be said, even if they cost her everything. The bell above the door chimed again, and another man entered the store. Someone Maggie had never seen before, but whose presence seemed to change the very air in the room. He was tall and lean, with dark hair touched by silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes marked him as a traveler, someone who'd seen more of the world than most people in Millbrook ever would. Marcus turned toward the newcomer, his chest puffing up with borrowed authority. "Stores closed for official business, stranger. You'll need to come back later." The man looked from Marcus to Maggie, taking in her tear-stained face and the deputy's threatening posture. Something cold and dangerous flickered in his gray eyes. "Official business?" the stranger asked, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made Marcus take an unconscious step backward. "What kind of official business involves threatening a woman?" The stranger's boots clicked against the wooden floor like bullets dropping into a gun chamber as he stepped deeper into Henderson's general store, his storm-gray eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Maggie could feel the tension in the room change from uncomfortable to dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes during a prairie thunderstorm. Marcus straightened his shoulders and puffed out his chest, trying to make himself look bigger and more important. Like I said, stranger, this is official town business. Deputy Marcus Reed, and you'd best move along before you find yourself in trouble. The man tilted his head slightly, studying Marcus the way a hawk studies a mouse before deciding whether it's worth the hunt. James Mitchell, he said simply, offering his name like it was a gift he wasn't sure Marcus deserved. And I'm curious about what kind of town business requires a grown man to intimidate a woman who's clearly done nothing wrong. Done nothing wrong? Marcus laughed, but the sound came out sharp and nervous. Mister, you obviously don't know what kind of woman you're defending. James's eyes flicked to Maggie, taking in her simple brown dress, her trembling hands, and the way she held herself upright despite being surrounded by people who wanted to see her fall. I see a woman who's being bullied by someone who should be protecting her instead of threatening her. She's brought shame to our town, Marcus insisted, his hand moving closer to his gun, walking around flaunting her condition like it's something to be proud of. The decent folks here don't want their children exposed to that kind of influence. Her condition? James repeated the words slowly, like he was tasting something bitter. You mean the fact that she's going to have a baby? She's not married, Marcus said, as if those 3 words explained everything wrong with the world. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Marcus to Mr. Henderson, who was still pretending to be very busy behind his counter, and finally back to Maggie. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but carried the kind of steel that could cut through iron. So let me understand this correctly. You're threatening to arrest a woman because she's pregnant and unmarried, in a country that supposedly believes in freedom and justice for all. It's not about arrest, Marcus said quickly, though his face turned red like he'd been caught in a lie. It's about maintaining order, about protecting the moral standards of our community. Whose moral standards? James asked. Because from where I stand, it looks like your moral standards include ganging up on someone who can't fight back. Where I come from, we call that cowardice. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Marcus's face went from red to purple, and his hand finally closed around the handle of his pistol. But James didn't seem worried. If anything, he looked almost bored, like men pulling guns on him was something that happened every Tuesday. You want to draw that weapon, deputy? James asked mildly. Because I should probably mention that I spent 3 years in the war, and I've gotten pretty good at handling men who think a badge gives them the right to hurt innocent people. Mr. Henderson suddenly found his voice. Now, gentlemen, there's no need for violence in my store. Maybe we can all just calm down and... Maybe, James interrupted without taking his eyes off Marcus. Your deputy here can explain to me exactly what law this woman has broken, because last I checked, being pregnant wasn't a crime in Kansas. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. The truth was, Maggie hadn't broken any law that could be written down in a book. She'd violated the unwritten rules that small towns used to control people's lives, but those weren't the kind of rules that would hold up in a real court with a real judge. She's disturbing the peace, Marcus finally said, grasping for any official-sounding reason to justify his actions. By shopping for flour? James's eyebrows rose. That's the most peaceful thing I can think of. Maggie watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she'd felt completely alone, facing the judgment and cruelty of her neighbors without a single person willing to stand beside her. Now this stranger had walked into her worst moment and was fighting for her like she actually mattered, like her life had value beyond what other people thought of her choices. You don't understand, Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice. You're not from here. You don't know how things work in a decent town. You're right, James agreed. I'm not from here. I'm from places where people judge others by their character instead of their circumstances. I'm from places where men protect women instead of threatening them. And if that's not how things work in your decent town, Then maybe your town isn't as decent as you think it is. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even the usual sounds from the street seemed muffled, as if the whole world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Finally, Marcus's hand moved away from his gun. He wasn't backing down because he wanted to, but because he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. James Mitchell might be a stranger, but he carried himself like a man who'd seen real trouble and come out the other side stronger for it. "This isn't over," Marcus said, trying to save face as he backed toward the door. "The council's still going to want her gone, and one stranger isn't going to change that." "We'll see," James replied calmly. After Marcus left, the store felt different. Bigger somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the air itself. Mr. Henderson emerged from behind his counter, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said quietly. "About what happened. About what I said earlier. This isn't how your father would have wanted you treated in my store." Maggie nodded, accepting the apology even though it came too late to heal the hurt. Mr. Henderson was a good man at heart, but good men sometimes needed someone braver to show them how to do the right thing. James turned to face her fully for the first time, and Maggie felt her breath catch in her throat. Up close, she could see lines around his eyes that spoke of hard experience, and a sadness that seemed carved into his very bones. This was a man who'd lost things that couldn't be replaced, who understood pain in ways that most people never would. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. The simple question, asked with genuine concern instead of judgment, nearly broke her composure. "I think so," she managed to say. "Thank you for standing up to him. Any decent person would have done the same thing." "No," Maggie said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people in this town have made it very clear that they think I deserve whatever happens to me." James studied her face for a moment, and she had the strange feeling that he could see past all her defenses to the frightened, lonely girl underneath. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maggie O'Brien." "Well, Miss O'Brien, it seems to me that you're in need of some allies, and I happen to be between destinations at the moment." Something in his tone made her heart skip like a stone across water. "What are you saying?" James smiled for the first time since entering the store, and the expression transformed his whole face. "I'm saying that maybe it's time this town learned what happens when they pick on someone who's not as alone as they thought she was." But even as hope began to bloom in Maggie's chest like a flower after rain, she couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles were far from over. If anything, James Mitchell's arrival might have just made them more complicated than she could imagine. What would happen when the town council discovered that their plans to drive her away had been interrupted by a stranger who didn't play by their rules? The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of the Millbrook courthouse as the 5 members of the town council sat around a scarred wooden table, their faces grim as undertakers discussing funeral arrangements. Mayor William Hastings drummed his thick fingers on the table's surface while the others waited for him to speak, the sound echoing through the small room like distant thunder. "Gentlemen," Mayor Hastings finally said, his voice heavy with the authority of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. "We have a problem that needs immediate attention." Banker Robert Caldwell leaned forward in his chair, his pale eyes glittering with the same cold satisfaction his wife had shown when confronting Maggie in her home. "If you're talking about the O'Brien girl, I thought Marcus was handling that situation. My wife and her friends made our position quite clear." "That's just it," Mayor Hastings replied, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket. "Marcus came to see me an hour ago. Seems there's been a complication." Dr. Samuel Porter, the town's only physician, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and peered at the paper with professional curiosity. "What kind of complication?" "A stranger." Mayor Hastings said the word like it tasted bad. "Some drifter named James Mitchell who decided to interfere when Marcus was trying to convince Miss O'Brien to leave town voluntarily." Reverend Joshua Harper, whose Sunday sermons had become increasingly focused on the sins of unmarried women, clasped his hands together and shook his head sadly. "The devil often sends temptation when righteous people are trying to do God's work. Perhaps this stranger is a test of our resolve." The fifth member of the council, Judge Franklin Moore, had been unusually quiet during the discussion. Now he cleared his throat and spoke carefully, like a man walking across thin ice. Gentlemen, I feel compelled to point out that we're treading on dangerous ground here. Miss O'Brien hasn't actually broken any laws that I'm aware of. Laws? Banker Caldwell's face turned red as fresh paint. What about moral laws? What about the standards that hold civilized society together? Are we supposed to just ignore them because some bleeding heart judge is worried about technicalities? Judge Moore's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. I'm worried about the Constitution, Robert, and about the fact that we're discussing ways to force a young woman to leave her home based on nothing more than gossip and moral posturing. Moral posturing? Reverend Harper rose from his chair so quickly it scraped against the wooden floor. Judge Moore, I'm shocked to hear such words from a man who's supposed to uphold the principles this community was founded on. I uphold the law, Judge Moore replied firmly. And the law says that every citizen has the right to live where they choose, regardless of what their neighbors think of their personal choices. Mayor Hastings raised his hand for silence before the argument could escalate further. Gentlemen, we're not here to debate philosophy. We're here to solve a practical problem before it gets out of hand. Dr. Porter, who had remained silent through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. Perhaps I'm missing something, but what exactly is the problem? Miss O'Brien is a quiet young woman who keeps to herself and bothers no one. Yes, she's pregnant and unmarried, but that's hardly unique in frontier towns. Why are we treating her like she's committed some terrible crime? The question hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire, making everyone uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. The truth was that Maggie O'Brien had become a symbol rather than a person, a convenient target for all the fears and frustrations of people trying to build something respectable out of the rough materials of frontier life. Because, Banker Caldwell said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, she represents everything that could go wrong with our community if we don't maintain proper standards. If we allow her to stay, what message does that send to other young women? What does it tell them about the consequences of immoral behavior? It tells them that they're human beings with rights, Judge Moore replied sharply. It tells them that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Their worth is determined by their character, Reverend Harper insisted. And character is shown through actions. Miss O'Brien's actions have shown a clear lack of moral guidance. Dr. Porter leaned back in his chair and studied the Reverend with the same careful attention he gave to difficult patients. Reverend, in my years of practice, I've delivered dozens of babies to unmarried women. Some of those women went on to become pillars of their communities. Others struggled with poverty and hardship. But in every case, the determining factor in their success wasn't whether they'd made mistakes in their youth. It was whether their community supported them or abandoned them. That's exactly the point, Mayor Hastings said, seizing on the doctor's words. We can't support behavior that goes against everything we're trying to build here. If we make exceptions for Miss O'Brien, where does it end? It ends with us being the kind of people we claim to be, Judge Moore said quietly. It ends with us showing the same mercy we hope to receive when we make our own mistakes. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more thoughtful. These men had come together expecting to discuss a simple solution to an embarrassing problem, but instead they found themselves confronting questions about the kind of community they wanted to create. Finally, Banker Caldwell spoke again, his voice harder than before. Regardless of our philosophical differences, we still have a practical issue to address. This stranger who interfered with Marcus. He could be a real problem if he decides to make Miss O'Brien's cause his own. What do we know about him? Mayor Hastings asked. Not much, the banker admitted. Marcus said he carried himself like a military man, spoke with authority, wasn't intimidated by the badge. Could be a drifter, could be someone with connections elsewhere. Dr. Porter frowned thoughtfully. If he's willing to stand up to our deputy on behalf of someone he's never met, he's either very brave or very foolish. Either way, he's not likely to be scared off easily. Then we need to be smarter about this, Mayor Hastings said. Direct confrontation obviously isn't working. We need a different approach. Reverend Harper's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. What if we don't have to force her to leave? What if we simply make it impossible for her to stay? The other men looked at him with interest, waiting for him to explain. Think about it, the Reverend continued. She needs food, shelter, work, all the things that require cooperation from her neighbors. If we make it clear to everyone in town that helping Miss O'Brien means facing social consequences themselves, she'll have no choice but to find somewhere else to live. Judge Moore's face darkened with disgust. You're talking about starving her out, about turning an entire community against one helpless woman. I'm talking about natural consequences, Reverend Harper replied smoothly. If people choose not to associate with someone whose behavior they find objectionable, that's their right as free citizens. And if they choose to help her, Dr. Porter added quietly, that's their right too. Mayor Hastings drummed his fingers on the table again, considering the Reverend's suggestion. It was cruel, certainly, but it was also legal. No one could accuse them of violating Miss O'Brien's rights if they simply encouraged their fellow citizens to exercise their own rights to choose their associates. It could work, he said finally, but we'd have to be careful about how we handle this stranger. If he's determined to help her, he might find ways around our community standards. Banker Caldwell smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Then maybe it's time we found out exactly who James Mitchell is and what he really wants in Millbrook. But none of them could have predicted that James Mitchell was about to make a move that would change everything they thought they knew about the situation. What would happen when a man with nothing left to lose decided that saving Maggie O'Brien was worth risking everything he had left? The rope bit into Maggie's wrists like angry snakes as Deputy Marcus Reed dragged her down Millbrook's main street, dust clouds rising around her torn skirt, while the morning crowd gathered like vultures circling wounded prey. What had started as a simple trip to the post office had become a nightmare when Marcus decided that James Mitchell's interference the day before required a stronger response. This is what happens, Marcus shouted to the growing crowd, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man finally getting his way. When decent folks try to be patient with those who refuse to listen to reason. Maggie's knees scraped against the rough ground as she struggled to keep up with Marcus's determined pace. Behind her, she could hear the voices of the townspeople. Some shocked, some excited, all of them treating her humiliation like entertainment at a county fair. Mrs. Caldwell's voice rose above the rest, sharp and triumphant. Let this be a lesson to any other young women who think they can ignore proper behavior. This is what comes of refusing good Christian guidance. The physical pain was nothing compared to the burning shame that filled Maggie's chest as familiar faces lined the street to watch her downfall. Mr. Thompson, who had known her father. Mrs. Riley, who had taught her piano lessons. Even young Tommy Peterson, barely 12 years old, staring with wide eyes at the spectacle of a grown woman being treated like a criminal. From his position on the wooden sidewalk outside the barber shop, James Mitchell watched the scene unfold with the cold calculation of a man deciding whether to start a war. His hands hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight as a spring ready to snap. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 32 years to recognize it when it wore the mask of righteousness. Enough, James said quietly, but his voice cut through the crowd noise like a blade through silk. Marcus stopped dragging Maggie and turned toward the sound, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. I told you yesterday, stranger. This is town business. Keep walking or you'll find yourself in the same position as this woman. Will I? James stepped down from the sidewalk into the dusty street, moving with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned to fight in places where hesitation meant death. You planning to tie up every person in town who thinks treating a pregnant woman like a criminal is wrong? A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing for the first time how their morning entertainment might look to an outsider. Others pressed closer, sensing that the real show was about to begin. Banker Caldwell pushed through the crowd, his face red with authority and indignation. Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? You're new to our community, so perhaps you don't understand our ways. Miss O'Brien has been given multiple opportunities to handle her situation discreetly and appropriately. Her continued presence here is disturbing the peace. Disturbing the peace? James looked around at the mob of people gathered to watch a woman being humiliated. I'd say the peace was already pretty well disturbed before I got here. The town council has voted, Mayor Hastings announced, stepping forward with the ponderous dignity of a man used to having his words treated as law. Miss O'Brien is no longer welcome in Millbrook. She's being escorted to the town limits for the safety and moral health of our community. James's eyes never left Marcus, but his words were directed at the mayor. Escorted? That's an interesting word for dragging someone through the street with a rope. Sometimes, Reverend Harper called out from his position near the church steps, the Lord requires us to take firm action against sin. Miss O'Brien has had every chance to repent and change her ways. Repent for what? James asked, his voice growing dangerously quiet. For being human? For making a mistake? For having the audacity to exist in your perfect little town? Dr. Porter had been standing silently near the edge of the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his hands and his face pale with distress. Now he stepped forward, his voice shaking with either fear or anger. This has gone too far, he said, looking directly at Mayor Hastings. Whatever our feelings about Miss O'Brien's situation, this treatment is barbaric. She's pregnant, for God's sake. She could be injured. She should have thought of that before she chose to defy the council's decision, Banker Caldwell replied coldly. James had heard enough. He moved toward Marcus with the kind of purposeful stride that made experienced fighters step aside, but the deputy was too drunk on his own power to recognize the danger approaching him. Let her go, James said simply. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Or what? You'll draw on a lawman? That's a hanging offense, stranger. I don't need to draw on you, James replied calmly. I just need to prove that badge doesn't make you bulletproof. The words hung in the air like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Everyone in the crowd seemed to hold their breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Marcus's hand moved toward his gun, but James was already moving, covering the distance between them in 3 quick steps. What happened next was too fast for most of the spectators to follow clearly. A blur of motion that ended with Marcus on his back in the dust and James holding the deputy's pistol like it had always belonged to him. Now, James said conversationally, as if he hadn't just disarmed a lawman in front of half the town. Let's discuss this situation like reasonable people. The crowd erupted in confused voices, some shouting for the marshal, others demanding that someone arrest the stranger, still others calling for calm. But James ignored them all, focusing his attention on Maggie, who was staring at him with wonder and terror mixed together in her dark eyes. He knelt beside her and gently worked the rope loose from her wrists, his fingers careful not to cause her any additional pain. Are you hurt? He asked softly. Maggie shook her head, though her hands were bleeding from the rope burns and her dress was torn beyond repair. Why are you doing this? She whispered. You don't even know me. James helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs proved unsteady. I know enough, he said. I know you don't deserve this. I know these people are wrong. And I know that sometimes standing up for what's right is more important than staying safe. From the ground, Marcus struggled to sit up, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. You just assaulted a peace officer. The territorial marshal will hear about this. I'm sure he will, James agreed. And when he does, I'll be happy to explain why I had to stop you from abusing a pregnant woman. I don't think that conversation will go the way you're hoping it will. Mayor Hastings stepped forward, his voice heavy with official authority. Mr. Mitchell, you're obviously a man of action, but you're interfering with legal proceedings. Miss O'Brien was given a choice: leave voluntarily or face the consequences of her continued defiance. She chose defiance. Did she? James looked around at the crowd of hostile faces. Because from where I stand, it looks like she never had a choice at all. You decided her fate before you even talked to her. The law, Banker Caldwell began. The law, James interrupted, says that every citizen has rights, regardless of what their neighbors think of their personal lives. The law says that pregnant women don't get dragged through the street like criminals. The law says a lot of things that don't seem to matter much in your perfect little town. The crowd was growing restless, uncertain how to respond to the stranger who seemed unimpressed by their authority and unafraid of their numbers. Some were beginning to drift away, perhaps uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed or participated in. But James wasn't finished yet. He had one more card to play, one more move that would change everything the people of Millbrook thought they knew about this situation. "Miss O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the street, "I have a proposal that might solve everyone's problems." What was James Mitchell about to offer that could possibly resolve a situation that had already torn the town apart? The words that came out of James Mitchell's mouth next would echo through Millbrook for generations. Spoken in the dust of Main Street with half the town as witnesses and the morning sun bearing down like the eye of God himself. "Miss O'Brien," James said, his voice steady as granite while the crowd pressed closer to hear every syllable. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The silence that followed was so complete that Maggie could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like drums before a battle. Around them, the faces of the townspeople showed expressions ranging from shock to outrage to something that might have been relief, as if James had suddenly offered them a way out of the trap they'd built for themselves. Mayor Hastings was the first to find his voice, sputtering like a tea kettle that had boiled too long. "Now see here, Mr. Mitchell, this is highly irregular. You can't just... You don't even know this woman." "I know she's brave," James replied, never taking his eyes off Maggie's face. "I know she's been treated shamefully by people who should have protected her. I know she's carrying a child who deserves better than to be born into hatred and judgment. That seems like enough to build a marriage on." Mrs. Caldwell pushed through the crowd, her face purple with indignation. "This is preposterous. Marriage is a sacred institution, not some theatrical gesture designed to thwart justice." "Justice?" Dr. Porter stepped forward, his quiet voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "Is that what we're calling this? Because it looks more like a lynching to me." Reverend Harper raised his hands for attention, his voice taking on the rolling cadence he used for Sunday sermons. "My friends, we must not let emotion cloud our judgment. While Mr. Mitchell's gesture is unexpected, we cannot ignore the fact that Miss O'Brien's condition already exists. A hasty marriage cannot undo what has already been done." "What exactly has been done?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because all I see is a woman who's going to have a baby. Last I checked, babies were considered blessings, not curses." Maggie found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." James turned his full attention to her, and she felt the weight of his gray eyes like a warm blanket on a cold night. "Maybe I don't owe you anything," he said softly, "but I owe myself the chance to do something right for once. I owe myself the chance to protect someone instead of failing them." There was pain in his words, old and deep as a canyon carved by years of flowing water. Maggie sensed that this moment meant more to James than it did to her, that somehow saving her was also saving himself. "This is madness," Marcus Reed said from the ground where he still sat, nursing his bruised pride along with his physical injuries. "You can't marry someone to spite a whole town." "Watch me," James replied simply. Banker Caldwell stepped forward, his business sense finally overriding his moral outrage. "Even if such a marriage were to take place, it wouldn't change the fundamental problem. The child Miss O'Brien carries is not yours, Mr. Mitchell. The scandal remains." "Does it?" James looked around at the crowd with something approaching amusement. "Because I thought the scandal was that she was unmarried. If she's married, that problem is solved. As for the child," he placed a protective hand on Maggie's shoulder. "Any child my wife bears will be my child, regardless of biology." The simple declaration hit the crowd like a physical blow. Some of the women began to whisper among themselves, perhaps realizing that their carefully constructed moral argument was crumbling around them. If Maggie was married, if her child would have a father's name, what exactly were they protesting anymore? Judge Moore, who had been notably silent during the council meeting the night before, now stepped forward with the deliberate movement of a man making an important decision. If Miss O'Brien consents to this marriage, I see no legal impediment to performing the ceremony immediately. Franklin, Mayor Hastings turned on the judge with betrayal written across his face. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, Judge Moore replied. Mr. Mitchell has made a legitimate proposal of marriage to Miss O'Brien. If she accepts, it's my duty as a judge to perform the ceremony if requested. That's the law, gentlemen. The same law you've been so eager to invoke when it suited your purposes. All eyes turned to Maggie, standing in her torn dress with rope burns on her wrists and dust in her hair. She looked like a survivor of some terrible battle, which in many ways she was. But as she met James's steady gaze, something shifted in her expression. A spark of hope that had been buried under months of shame and fear. I accept, she said clearly, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Mr. Mitchell, I'll marry you. The crowd erupted in a chaos of voices, some angry, some excited, all of them trying to process this unexpected turn of events. But James smiled for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, and the expression transformed his entire face from hard and weathered to something approaching handsome. Then let's get married, he said simply. Reverend Harper stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. As the spiritual leader of this community, I must protest this hasty union. Marriage performed under such circumstances, without proper counseling or preparation, is still legal, Judge Moore interrupted firmly. And if Reverend Harper is unwilling to perform the ceremony, I'm certainly qualified to do so myself. The Reverend's face turned red at the implied criticism of his willingness to serve his flock. That is, if the couple truly wishes to proceed. We do, James and Maggie said simultaneously, their voices blending together in a harmony that surprised them both. As Judge Moore began to recite the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, using the Kansas Territory's civil vows since no church was involved, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The sense that she wasn't completely alone in the world. This man standing beside her was a stranger, true enough, but he was also someone who had looked at her situation and chosen to stand with her instead of against her. The ceremony was brief and unconventional, performed in the dusty street with a crowd of hostile witnesses and the smell of horses and leather heavy in the air. But when James slipped a simple gold band onto Maggie's finger, a ring that had appeared from somewhere in his coat pocket, she felt the weight of it like an anchor in a storm. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Kansas, Judge Moore pronounced, his voice carrying clearly across the street, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James leaned down and kissed Maggie gently on the forehead, a gesture more tender than passionate, but somehow more meaningful because of its restraint. As he straightened, he looked out at the crowd of townspeople who had been so eager to drive his new wife away from her home. Now, he said conversationally, I believe my wife and I would like to go home and start our married life in peace, unless anyone has any further objections to a married woman living in town. The silence that greeted his question was answer enough. The moral crusade that had seemed so righteous an hour before had suddenly become much more complicated. But as the crowd began to disperse and the newlyweds walked toward Maggie's small house, none of them could have predicted that their troubles were far from over, and that the biggest test of this unlikely marriage was still to come. The golden photograph on Maggie's mantelpiece caught the lamplight like a window into another world as she discovered the truth that would change everything she thought she knew about her new husband. While James chopped firewood outside their small home 3 days after their wedding, Maggie had been trying to make the cabin feel like theirs instead of just hers, rearranging furniture and adding small touches that might help two strangers learn to live as husband and wife. But the photograph stopped her cold. A beautiful woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Both faces looked back at Maggie with the warmth of people who had never known tragedy, people who believed the world was fundamentally good and safe. Her name was Catherine, James said quietly from the doorway, making Maggie jump like a startled rabbit. She hadn't heard him come inside, hadn't noticed the chopping sound stop. The boy is Daniel, my son. Maggie's hand flew to her throat, her heart pounding with the shock of discovery. Your son? But you never said. When you proposed, you didn't mention. That I was already a husband and father? James set down his axe and moved slowly into the room, his eyes fixed on the photograph with an expression that mixed love and pain in equal measure. Would it have changed your answer if you'd known? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to ignore but difficult to breathe around. Maggie found herself studying this man she'd married, really looking at him for the first time since their dramatic wedding in the dusty street. The lines around his eyes weren't just from sun and weather, they were carved by grief. The careful way he moved wasn't just natural grace. It was the wariness of someone who'd learned that happiness could be stolen without warning. I don't know, Maggie answered honestly. Maybe. Tell me what happened to them. James lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the fireplace, his movements heavy as if the weight of memory was a physical burden. Fever took them both, just outside Denver. We'd been traveling west, looking for a place to start fresh after the war. Daniel got sick first. Then Catherine caught it trying to nurse him back to health. His voice was steady, but Maggie could see his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. This wasn't a story he'd told often, maybe not at all since it happened. I buried them under a cottonwood tree beside a creek that ran clean and cold, James continued. Daniel loved the sound of running water. Used to say it sounded like the creek was singing him to sleep. Maggie felt tears burning behind her eyes, though she couldn't say if they were for James's loss or for her own situation. Here she was, married to a man who had loved someone else so completely that he carried their memory like a sacred treasure. How could she possibly compete with ghosts? How long ago? She asked softly. 3 years. I've been moving ever since. Couldn't seem to stay in one place long enough to grow roots. Every town reminded me of what I'd lost. Every family I saw made the emptiness feel bigger. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation, hoofbeats drumming against the hard earth like distant thunder. James was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun belt he still wore even inside their home. The wariness that had kept him alive during 3 years of wandering hadn't disappeared just because he'd put a wedding ring on his finger. Through the window, they could see 3 riders approaching fast, dust clouds trailing behind them like brown smoke. Even in the fading evening light, Maggie recognized the lead rider's familiar silhouette. It's Billy, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. Billy Garrett pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the cabin, his 2 companions flanking him like soldiers preparing for battle. He was dressed in his finest clothes, the expensive riding jacket his father had ordered from Chicago, the polished boots that marked him as someone who'd never worked a day with his hands. But his face showed a wildness that Maggie had never seen before, a desperation that made him look dangerous despite his privileged background. Maggie, Billy called out, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Maggie, come out here. We need to talk. James stepped onto the porch, his presence filling the doorway like a human barrier between Billy and the woman inside. Evening, he said calmly. Something I can help you with? Billy's face twisted with frustration and something that might have been pain. You can step aside and let me talk to Maggie. This is between us. Actually, James replied with dangerous quietness. Anything concerning my wife is between me and whoever's bothering her. That would be you, I'm guessing. One of Billy's companions, a man Maggie recognized as Tom Morrison from the livery stable, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Billy, maybe we should. Shut up, Tom, Billy snapped, never taking his eyes off James. Maggie, I know you can hear me. Come out here and explain why you married this stranger instead of waiting for me to figure things out. Maggie stepped onto the porch beside James, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear that was making her legs shake. Figure what out, Billy? You had months to figure things out. You chose your engagement to marry Catherine instead. Billy dismounted with the fluid grace that had first caught her attention at last spring's church social. But now his movements seemed threatening rather than attractive. I chose my family's future. I chose not to destroy everything my father built. But I've been thinking, and maybe there's still a way. There's no way, Maggie interrupted, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I'm married now, Billy. To a good man who wasn't ashamed to claim me in front of the whole town. A good man. Billy laughed, but the sound held no humor. You don't know anything about him. He could be anyone. A criminal, a deserter, a man running from his past. James stepped forward slightly, and Maggie could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Careful, boy. You're about to say something you can't take back. Am I? Billy's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, a gesture more reflexive than intentional, but threatening enough to change the entire atmosphere of the confrontation. Maybe it's time someone asked some hard questions about the mysterious James Mitchell. Where did you come from? What are you running from? Why would a stranger marry a pregnant woman unless he had reasons of his own to hide? The questions hit closer to home than Billy could have known. James was running from something, not the law or criminal behavior, but from grief so profound it had nearly destroyed him. And he had married Maggie partly to save her, but also to save himself from the endless wandering that had become his life after losing his family. My reasons are my own, James said quietly. But they don't include taking advantage of anyone or running from justice. Can you say the same? Billy's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. I never took advantage of Maggie. We loved each other. Did you? James asked mildly. Because love usually involves standing by someone when things get difficult. Love doesn't usually involve letting someone face consequences alone while you protect your own reputation. The truth of the words hung in the evening air like the smell of gunpowder before a battle. Billy's mouth opened and closed without sound, his carefully prepared arguments crumbling under the weight of simple honesty. But as the confrontation escalated, none of them noticed the fourth rider approaching from the opposite direction, someone whose arrival would change everything they thought they knew about the situation. What new complication was about to ride into their lives just when it seemed like the past had finally caught up with them? The fourth rider emerged from the gathering dusk like a ghost made flesh, his horse moving at a steady trot that spoke of long miles traveled and urgent business awaiting. Marshal Frank Thompson of the Kansas Territory rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years settling disputes that other people couldn't handle, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight like a small star pinned to his vest. Behind him rode two more men, federal deputies whose presence immediately changed the nature of whatever was about to unfold. This wasn't a local matter anymore, if it ever had been. This was something bigger, something that had drawn the attention of authorities beyond Millbrook's narrow borders. Billy Garrett's hand froze halfway to his gun as he recognized the marshal, his face going pale as fresh milk. The other two men with him seemed to shrink in their saddles, suddenly realizing they'd stumbled into something far more serious than a domestic dispute. Evening, folks, Marshal Thompson said pleasantly, though his eyes were sharp as a hawk's as they took in the scene before him. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. James stepped forward slightly, his military bearing evident as he nodded respectfully to the lawman. Marshal, what brings federal authority to our little domestic discussion? Well now, Marshal Thompson dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been stiffened by too many years in the saddle. That's an interesting question. See, I've been getting some complaints about the situation in Millbrook. Seems there's been some disagreement about how to handle certain local matters. He looked directly at Billy, whose expensive clothes and nervous posture marked him as clearly as a brand on cattle. You'd be young Mr. Garrett, I'm guessing. Son of Robert Garrett, owns the bank here. Billy's voice came out as a squeak before he cleared his throat and tried again. Yes, sir. Is there some problem? Might be, the marshal replied casually. See, your father sent a telegram to Topeka 3 days ago. Seems he was concerned about some stranger threatening local peace officers and disrupting lawful proceedings. Asked for federal assistance in handling the situation. Maggie felt her stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water. Of course Banker Garrett would try to use his connections to get rid of James. Of course the wealthy and powerful would reach beyond local authority when local authority wasn't enough to get them what they wanted. But Marshal Thompson wasn't finished talking. Course, when federal marshals get called in, we like to do our own investigation instead of just taking one side's word for things. Funny thing about investigations, Sometimes they turn up information that folks weren't expecting. One of the federal deputies, a lean man with intelligent eyes, spoke for the first time. We stopped in 3 towns between here and Topeka, asking questions about recent events. Got some interesting answers. James remained perfectly still, but Maggie could sense his alertness, like a cat watching a dangerous dog. What kind of answers? He asked quietly. The kind that suggest young Mr. Garrett here might not be the innocent victim his father portrayed in that telegram, Marshal Thompson replied. See, people talk in small towns. And when federal deputies start asking questions, people tend to remember things they might have forgotten otherwise. Billy's face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were visibly shaking now. I don't know what you think you've heard, but we heard about a young woman who got pregnant and was abandoned by the father. The second deputy interrupted, his voice hard as winter ground. We heard about a town that decided to solve their moral crisis by driving that woman out instead of holding the responsible party accountable. We heard, Marshal Thompson continued, about a deputy who dragged a pregnant woman through the street with a rope while good citizens stood by and watched. That last part was particularly interesting to us, since last I checked, that kind of behavior wasn't legal anywhere in the United States. The marshal's eyes fixed on Billy with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read guilt in people's faces. But the most interesting thing we heard was about a young man from a prominent family who got a girl pregnant and then let her take all the consequences while he went ahead with his engagement to someone else. Someone whose family had money and social standing. Billy's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, but no words came out. His carefully constructed world of privilege and protection was crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Now, Marshal Thompson said conversationally, abandoning a pregnant woman might not be a federal crime, but conspiracy to violate someone's civil rights certainly is, and when local law enforcement participates in that conspiracy. He let the implications hang in the air like smoke. James spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carefully neutral. Marshal, I appreciate your investigation, but my wife and I just want to be left alone to build our life together. We're not looking for revenge or federal intervention. That's commendable, Mr. Mitchell, the marshal replied. But the federal government has an interest in making sure that local authorities don't abuse their power, regardless of what the victims might prefer. He turned back to Billy, whose 2 companions had quietly backed their horses away, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Mr. Garrett, you have some choices to make. You can ride back to town and explain to your father that his telegram has opened a federal investigation into civil rights violations in Millbrook. You can tell him that continuing to harass Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell will result in federal charges being filed. Billy found his voice at last, though it came out weak and desperate. But Maggie, the baby, it's mine. I have rights. You gave up those rights when you abandoned her, the first deputy said coldly. The moment she married Mr. Mitchell, any legal claim you might have had disappeared. That child will be born with Mr. Mitchell's name, and that's the end of it. Furthermore, Marshal Thompson added, if we hear about any more harassment, any more attempts to drive Mrs. Mitchell from her home, any more violations of her civil rights, we'll be back. And next time, we won't be asking polite questions. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Billy and his family had overplayed their hand, thinking their local influence could solve any problem. Instead, they'd drawn federal attention to behavior that looked very different when viewed from outside Millbrook's insular community. Billy mounted his horse with shaking hands, his face a mask of defeat and humiliation. This isn't over, he said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Yes, it is, James replied quietly. It's been over since the moment your wife said, I do, in front of half the town. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to accept that fact. As Billy and his companions rode away into the gathering darkness, Marshal Thompson turned to James and Maggie with something approaching a smile. You folks have any other problems with local harassment, you send word to Topeka. Federal government takes a dim view of communities that think they can ignore the Constitution when it suits them. Thank you, Marshal, Maggie said, her voice thick with gratitude and relief. I never expected, I didn't think anyone would care about what happened to someone like me. Mrs. Mitchell, the marshal said formally, the law is supposed to protect everyone equally, regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes it takes a while for that ideal to catch up with reality, but we're working on it. As the federal officers rode away toward town, James and Maggie stood together on their porch, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The immediate crisis had passed, but they both knew that the real work of building a marriage between two wounded souls was just beginning. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Maggie felt like she might actually have a chance at happiness. Not the fairy tale kind she dreamed of as a girl, but the real, complicated, imperfect kind that grew between two people willing to stand together against whatever the world threw at them. What challenges would test this unlikely marriage as winter approached and two strangers tried to become a family? The kitchen knife slipped from Maggie's trembling fingers and clattered to the wooden floor like a gunshot in the quiet cabin, drops of her blood spattering the potatoes she'd been trying to prepare for supper. 2 weeks had passed since the marshal's visit, 2 weeks of careful politeness and awkward silences, as she and James learned to share space like strangers staying in the same boarding house. "Let me see," James said, appearing beside her so quickly she wondered if he'd been watching from the doorway, waiting for her to need help. His hands were gentle as he examined the cut on her palm, his touch sending unexpected warmth up her arm. "It's nothing," Maggie protested, though the blood was flowing freely and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I'm just clumsy today." James guided her to the kitchen chair and knelt beside her, cleaning the wound with water from the wash basin. "You're not clumsy. You're scared. There's a difference." The simple observation hit closer to home than Maggie wanted to admit. She was scared, not of James, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, but of this strange new life they were trying to build together. She was scared of being a burden to a man who had already lost everything once. She was scared of the baby growing inside her, scared of what would happen when it was born and James had to face the daily reminder that she belonged to someone else first. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know how to be married to someone who—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Someone who what?" James asked gently, wrapping a clean cloth around her injured hand. "Someone who loved someone else first. Someone who had a real marriage before this pretend one." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rattling the windows and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields beyond town. James finished bandaging her hand before he spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Maggie, what Catherine and I had was real, and I won't pretend otherwise, but it's also over. She's been gone for 3 years, and I've been half dead ever since, just moving from place to place without purpose or hope." He moved to the other chair, sitting so they faced each other across the small kitchen table. "What you and I have might not be the same kind of love, but it's not pretend. We're both here by choice. We're both trying to build something new from the pieces of our broken lives." "But the baby," Maggie said, her hand moving instinctively to her growing belly. "When it's born, you'll have to look at it every day and remember that it's not yours. How can that not drive you away?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected at the same time. "Can I tell you something about Daniel?" he finally asked. Maggie nodded, sensing that whatever he was about to share would be important. "He wasn't my blood either," James said simply. "Catherine was already pregnant when we met. The father was a soldier who died at Gettysburg before he even knew he was going to be a daddy. I married Catherine knowing the child wasn't mine, and Daniel became the most important thing in my world." The revelation hit Maggie like cold water, reshaping everything she thought she understood about James's past. "But the way you talked about him, the love in your voice." "Love doesn't come from blood," James said firmly. "It comes from choice, from showing up every day and deciding that this person, this life, this family is worth fighting for. I chose to be Daniel's father, and he chose to be my son. That made us family in every way that mattered." Tears were running down Maggie's cheeks now, though she couldn't say exactly why. Relief, maybe, or gratitude for this man who seemed to understand that love was more complicated and more generous than she'd ever imagined. "The baby kicked yesterday," she said softly. "First time I really felt it move." James's face softened with something that might have been wonder. "What did it feel like?" "Like butterfly wings. Like a tiny fish swimming inside me." She hesitated, then added, Would you like to feel it? If it happens again." "I'd be honored," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. Outside, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment of intimacy. James was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun belt with the automatic response of a man who'd learned that danger could arrive without warning. Through the window, they could see a lone rider approaching fast, bent low over his horse's neck like someone fleeing pursuit. As he drew closer, Maggie recognized the familiar figure of Dr. Porter, his medical bag bouncing against his side as he urged his mount toward their cabin. James opened the door before the doctor could knock, taking in the man's pale face and urgent manner. "Doc? What's wrong?" Dr. Porter dismounted quickly, his hands shaking as he tied his horse to the porch rail. "It's Mary Catherine Thornton," he said breathlessly. "Billy's fiancée. She's taken sick, very sick. Her father sent me to find you, Mrs. Mitchell." "Me?" Maggie's voice came out as a squeak of surprise. "Why would he want me?" "Because," Dr. Porter said grimly, "she's been asking for you. Keep saying she needs to talk to you before it's too late." The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Mary Catherine Thornton, the sweet, innocent girl who was supposed to marry Billy and live happily ever after, was dying. And for some reason, she wanted to see the woman whose life had been destroyed to protect her engagement. James stepped closer to Maggie, his presence solid and reassuring. "What's wrong with her, Doc?" "Fever, same as took my own sister last winter. Could be pneumonia, could be something worse. Her lungs are filling with fluid, and she's burning up despite all the cool cloths we've tried." Dr. Porter's voice was heavy with the frustration of a medical man facing an enemy he couldn't defeat. "Why does she want to see me?" Maggie asked again, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Porter hesitated, then spoke carefully. "She's been saying things. About Billy. About secrets she's been carrying. Her father thinks she might have information that might change how people understand recent events." Maggie felt the world shift slightly under her feet. What could sweet Mary Catherine possibly know about Billy that would matter to anyone else? What secrets could a banker's daughter and mayor's niece be carrying that would be important enough to summon the woman her fiancé had wronged? James placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Maggie doesn't owe Mary Catherine anything. If the girl has something to confess, she can do it to her family or her preacher." "I know that," Dr. Porter said quickly. "But she's dying, Mrs. Mitchell. Whatever she has to say, she believes it's important enough to risk her soul over. Says she can't meet her maker with lies on her conscience." The moral weight of the request settled over Maggie like a heavy blanket. She didn't want to see Mary Catherine, didn't want to be drawn back into the drama that had nearly destroyed her life. But she also couldn't ignore the plea of a dying woman, even one whose happiness had come at the cost of Maggie's own. "I'll go," she said quietly, though every instinct told her this was a mistake. "Then I'm going with you," James said firmly. "Whatever Miss Thornton has to say, you don't have to face it alone." As they prepared to ride back to town with Dr. Porter, neither Maggie nor James could have predicted that Mary Catherine's deathbed confession would reveal a truth so shocking it would change everything they thought they knew about Billy Garrett and the events that had brought them together. What secret had the mayor's innocent niece been hiding that was important enough to risk her eternal soul to reveal? The mayor's grand house loomed against the stormy evening sky like a monument to respectability and wealth, its white columns and manicured gardens standing in stark contrast to the small cabin where Maggie and James had been building their quiet life together. Inside, the whispered voices of family members and friends created a hushed atmosphere of impending tragedy as they gathered around the bedside of Millbrook's most beloved young woman. Mary Catherine Thornton lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her usually rosy cheeks now pale as winter snow and her breathing labored like someone who'd run a great distance. But her eyes, when they fixed on Maggie standing hesitantly in the doorway, burned with the fierce intensity of someone who had something vital to say before time ran out. "Maggie," Mary Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Mayor Thornton, standing beside his daughter's bed like a guard protecting precious treasure, looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mary Catherine, sweetheart, you should rest. Whatever you think you need to say can wait until you're feeling better." "No, Papa," Mary Catherine said with surprising firmness for someone so weak. "It can't wait. I've been carrying this secret for too long, and I won't die with lies on my conscience." She struggled to sit up straighter, her eyes never leaving Maggie's face. "Everyone needs to leave except Maggie and her husband. What I have to say is for them first." "Absolutely not," declared Mrs. Thornton from her position beside the fireplace, her face flushed with indignation. "Mary Catherine, you're delirious from the fever. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying, Mama," Mary Catherine replied, her voice growing stronger with determination. "And if you don't give me privacy to say it, I'll announce it to the whole town from my deathbed. Is that what you want?" The threat carried enough conviction to make her parents exchange worried glances. Whatever Mary Catherine intended to confess, she was clearly prepared to make it public if necessary. Dr. Porter cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps it would be best to let Miss Thornton speak privately. Sometimes dying patients need to unburden themselves of guilt or regret. It's part of the natural process." Reluctantly, the family filed out of the room, leaving only Maggie, James, and the dying girl. Rain was falling harder now, drumming against the roof like urgent fingers tapping out a message in code. Mary Catherine waited until the door closed before speaking again, her words coming in rushed bursts between labored breaths. "Maggie, I know what everyone thinks about you and Billy. I know what he told his parents, what he told my parents, what he let the whole town believe." She paused to catch her breath, her hand clutching the white bedsheets with desperate intensity. "But it's not true. None of it is true." Maggie moved closer to the bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "What's not true?" "Billy didn't abandon you because he was afraid of his family's reaction," Mary Catherine said, her voice growing urgent despite her weakness. "He didn't choose me over you because of social pressure or family expectations." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "He chose me because I'm pregnant too, with his child. And unlike you, I threatened to tell everyone if he didn't marry me." The words hit the room like lightning striking a tree, splitting the air with their shocking revelation. Maggie felt her knees go weak, and James quickly moved to support her with a steady hand on her back. "What?" Maggie's voice came out as barely a whisper. Mary Catherine's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her pale cheeks. "We've been together for almost a year. Secret meetings in the old barn behind my father's property. Billy told me he loved me. Told me we'd be married as soon as he finished his business arrangements with your family." The casual cruelty of the phrase, business arrangements, made Maggie's stomach turn. She thought Billy loved her, thought their relationship had meant something real and precious. Instead, she'd been nothing more than a business transaction he was trying to complete. "But when I told him about my condition," Mary Catherine continued, "everything changed. Suddenly he was talking about how we needed to be together, how our families had always expected us to marry anyway. He said he'd handle the situation with you quietly and discreetly." James's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke. "Handle it how?" Mary Catherine closed her eyes as if the memory caused her physical pain. "He was going to offer your family money to send you away quietly. Make it look like you'd decided to leave town on your own rather than face the shame. He said no one would ever know about the baby if you just disappeared." The revelation painted Billy's abandonment of Maggie in an even more calculating light than anyone had imagined. He hadn't been a weak young man overcome by family pressure. He'd been a manipulative predator juggling two relationships and willing to destroy one woman's life to protect his plans with another. "But why are you telling me this now?" Maggie asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Mary Catherine's breathing was becoming more labored, her words coming in shorter bursts. Because when the town decided to drive you out, when they dragged you through the street like a criminal, I realized what kind of man I was going to marry. What kind of man would let that happen to someone he'd claimed to love? She gripped Maggie's hand with surprising strength. I tried to call off the engagement. Told Billy I couldn't marry someone so cruel. But he said it was too late, that I was already ruined and he was the only man who'd ever have me now. The picture of Billy Garrett that emerged from Mary Catherine's confession was of someone far more calculating and cruel than anyone in Millbrook had suspected. He'd been playing both women against each other, using their love and vulnerability to serve his own selfish purposes. There's more, Mary Catherine said weakly. Billy's been stealing from his father's bank. Small amounts over several months, thinking no one would notice. He needed money to set up a house for us in Kansas City after we married, somewhere far from both families. James leaned forward, his expression grim. Does anyone else know about this? The bank examiner is coming next week, Mary Catherine whispered. Billy's been trying to figure out how to replace the money before then. I think he hoped marrying me would give him access to my father's accounts to cover the theft. The scope of Billy's deception was staggering. He hadn't just been a weak young man making bad choices. He'd been a criminal willing to destroy multiple lives to cover his tracks and secure his future. Why didn't you tell someone sooner? Maggie asked gently. Mary Catherine's voice was fading now, her strength nearly spent. Because I loved him. Because I thought love meant protecting the person you cared about, even when they did terrible things. But watching what happened to you, seeing how everyone treated you, I realized that wasn't love. It was just fear and selfishness dressed up in pretty words. Outside, the storm was intensifying, thunder rolling across the prairie like the sound of Judgment Day approaching. But inside the quiet bedroom, 3 people sat with the weight of truth that would change everything for the town of Millbrook. Mary Catherine's eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment Maggie thought she'd fallen asleep. But then the dying girl spoke one last time, her voice barely audible above the storm. I'm sorry, Maggie, for everything, for not being brave enough to speak up sooner, for letting you suffer for our sins. I hope you can forgive me. As Mary Catherine Thornton slipped away into her final sleep, taking with her the last traces of Millbrook's illusions about respectability and innocence, Maggie and James sat in stunned silence, processing revelations that would reshape everything they thought they knew about justice, truth, and the price of love. What would happen when word of Mary Catherine's deathbed confession reached the rest of the town, and they learned that their moral crusade had been based on lies and manipulation?